You're listening to the first of a new series of interviews from Purdue University's Center on Religion and Chinese Society. On a periodic basis, we'll be releasing brief audio recordings of interviews with scholars who've made a significant contribution to research on religion in China. I'm Joey Marshall, a graduate student research assistant with the center, and my guest is Dr. Rodney Stark, who really needs no introduction, but I'll provide one anyway. Rodney Stark is a distinguished professor of the social sciences at Baylor University and co-director of Baylor's Institute for Studies on Religion. He's the author of more than 30 books, 2 of which won the Distinguished Book Award from the SSR, that's the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion. His scholarly articles have been published in the American Sociological Review, the American Journal of Sociology, the Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion, and many other outlets. His most recent book, co-authored with Xuehua Wang and published this year by Templeton Press, is entitled A Star in the East, The Rise of Christianity in China. Reviews describe the book as a well-written and stimulating account of the growth and prospects of Christianity in the world's largest socialist society. Dr. Rodney Stark, thanks for joining me.
I'm delighted to be with you.
First, can you tell us what kinds of research questions have piqued your interest in the last few years, and how does the study of religion in China fit into that?
Well, there are many ways in which China fits into my interest. One has to do with the whole secularization nonsense, the claim the world is becoming less religious, and for a long time people like to cite China as the interesting case where religion was going away. And the marvelous thing, of course, is after all those years of oppression with all the churches and pagodas and temples and whatnot smashed and closed, what do you know? Religion is alive and well and thriving in China, and that's why China was of particular interest to me.
So what can we learn from studying the growth of Christianity in China that we can't learn from studying religion in other parts of the world?
Well, I don't know that it's all that unique. What it does give an opportunity to do, it seems to me, is to show how religions can thrive and grow even under a very extreme oppression. I mean, during the Cultural Revolution, it was extremely dangerous to be religious. And yet, during that period, Christianity, and I don't know about the other religions, but Christianity grew enormously, despite the fact that you could be shot for it. And, people might say, well, how is that possible if they were really, looking around trying to detect any religious activity and going to really crack down on it? It has to do with the way conversions take place. You don't increase the size of religion by having big prayer meetings in public or having revival meetings. People don't convert that way. They convert on a one-to-one basis. People are converted by their friends and by their neighbors and by their relatives. People join a religious movement because the people they know and care about have joined it. And person-to-person conversion is invisible. There's no way the government can see it going on. And consequently, this enormous growth took place, and it's fascinating that it was possible. I mean, I knew it was possible, but the fact that it occurred is a way to prove to everybody it was possible.
So I appreciate your discussion of conversion here. And in fact, it reminds me of some of your early work, first with John Laughlin and then later with William Sims Bainbridge. So I'm wondering, how has your thinking about religious conversion evolved over time? And how has the study of religion in China influenced the way you think about conversion?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the last part.
Oh, I said, has the study of religion in China influenced the way you think about religious conversion?
No. And my thinking about conversion hasn't really changed in 30 years. I mean, Laughlin and I went out and looked at people converting to a religion and noticed that only people who were connected by bonds of friendship or marriage or family or whatnot ever converted. And subsequently, I have found an immense amount of evidence for that. in Mormon history, here, there, and everywhere. And as it turns out, a couple of Chinese sociologists who were familiar with my work did a wonderful job of building the proper questions into a survey that they conducted in rural China, in which they asked people, how did they first come to be aware of Christianity? How did they get connected to it? How many of their friends and relatives already belonged to it? And it's very revealing, because nobody had heard about it from meetings or publicity, or everybody had heard about it either from a neighbor or a friend or a relative. Those who had converted had many friends and relatives who were already Christians. The non-Christian Chinese tended to have very few friends or relatives who were Christians. And so, as a matter of fact, as you look around Chinese villages, what's interesting is that some villages are almost all Christian, and some villages are few or no Christians. Because if it gets started in the village, because villages are small and so closely integrated in terms of family and friendship and whatnot, if it gets started, it grows very rapidly in a village. And because these Chinese sociologists asked those questions, it was very nice to be able to show really good data on a large survey base, confirming that, in fact, relationships are the basis for conversion.
You mentioned data here, which reminds me of one of the perennial problems in the study of religion in China, which is a general lack of available survey data. In the book, you draw on 2 major surveys, and I'm wondering, after working with these data, what kinds of new data or new information do you think is most important for future researchers to collect?
The real problem, the Chinese government won't let any external polling agency ask any questions about religion or politics, which means that the wonderful Gallup World Polls, which are being done on 163 nations, their Chinese survey can't ask if you go to church and what's your religion and whatnot. But Chinese survey groups can ask those questions, and did. And so one of them was available through the World Values Studies, and one of them was available from the #1 Chinese polling firm, Horizon Incorporated. And they had done a big survey of religion in China, and it's legal for them to sell us the data after they've asked it. It isn't legal for us to go in there and hire them to do it. In addition to which, as I just mentioned, some Chinese scholars have done surveys in some of the villages. As a matter of fact, my co-author participated in some of those surveys, which is why we had access to the data. As to what should be asked, well, questions about how you encounter religion would be very nice. I think that right now I'm interested in the whole question of miracles, or people's perception of miracles. When asked if they had ever felt that they had been saved or benefited by a guardian angel, 53% of Americans in a recent survey said yes. Fascinating. And unless you think that they're just talking about, well, they thought they got a lucky break, it's not true. These people are talking about angels. And it's fascinating, and I would like to see a whole lot more surveys devoted to much more of the mystical aspect of religion, instead of just asking, do you believe in God, and do you go to church, and do you pray?
Can you talk a little bit about highly educated versus less educated Chinese, and also Chinese people who live in urban areas and rural areas, which you describe in the book?
Well, for 2 things here. One is, everybody would assume somehow that, and the Chinese, is that Christianity is growing in villages and among the rural poor. No. Yes, of course it's growing in the villages, but the results of our rural surveys, or rural people in the big, this Horizon survey's got more than 7,000 respondents, so we've got lots of rural people in there. And when you compare them, they're not different. What is different and important is that the more educated the Chinese are, the more likely they are to be Christians. Now, many people will be surprised by that, but you shouldn't be, because it's a big myth put out by silly sociologists who don't know anything, haven't ever studied anything, that religion appeals more to the poor than to the rich, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Not so. The elites have always been more religious. Most of the great religious movements in history didn't start with poor people. It started with, Buddha was a prince, and almost all of his early converts were from the nobility. Early Christianity appealed more to the privileged than the unprivileged. I know everybody quotes Paul saying, not many of you were rich, not many of you were noble. He didn't say none of you were. He said not many were, which means some were. And the fact of the matter is, in the Roman Empire, not many people were. The fact that there are some is really surprising. Or, the Gospels were in circulation by the year 70, 80. Who wrote them? A bunch of illiterate slaves? Who read them? A bunch of illiterate slaves? No, this was a privileged group. And in China, in fact, the more educated people are more likely to turn Christian. And I suspect it's because they feel the need more.
So I'd like to transition now and ask a final question that points us toward the future. Lately, we've seen a lot of news coverage that points to a recent crackdown on Christianity in China. For instance, this year, Christians in Zhejiang province have seen churches destroyed and rooftop crosses removed from a lot of church buildings. So I'd like to get your thoughts on the future of Christianity in China. Based on your research, do you think government oppression of Christianity in China will grow more or less severe in the future, and why?
Well, first of all, anybody who says he can predict the future is probably silly. On the other hand, there are some things that you can say are probable and likely. And in this case, the first thing to notice, that's one of China's many provinces that this is going on in, only one. And it's not so surprising that the local communist officials in one province are a bunch of old-fashioned Maoists who are very opposed to religion. Even so, they haven't closed churches. They haven't been sending Christians or religious people to camps or anything. They've cut the crosses off buildings. And by the way, there's something that should be pointed out. People talk about the underground church in China. All that means is underground church means that it isn't registered with the government. Some of these underground churches are 5 stories tall, so they aren't very underground. Everybody knows they're there. As for the future, the fact is that there are a lot of communist officials who've turned Christian. Out in the villages, the local communist leader often has a cross on his wall. So one has to notice that even though it's illegal for Communist Party members to be religious, many of them are. What does that mean for the future? I don't really know, but it suggests that a crackdown becomes increasingly less likely. Finally, let me say the most important single thing I think in the last XDX years has to do with the Catholic Church. The Catholics have always had a much harder time in China than the Protestants because the one thing the Chinese have, ever since Mao took over, really been resentful of is any outside ties. In other words, any group must be entirely Chinese and have no affiliation, no connections to non-Chinese institutions. The Catholic Church can't do that. They have ties to the Vatican. So they've always been in a problem, and there's this official Catholic Church that pretends not to have any ties to the Vatican, although probably it's pretty clear that they do, but they have to officially pretend not to. But about 3 weeks ago, a bishop was installed in the Chinese Communist Church, in the government-controlled Chinese Communist Church, who had been previously approved for a bishopric by the Vatican. The government not only knew it, but announced it when it approved of the appointment of the bishop, which means that, at least in this instance, the government has given up and said it's okay for Chinese Catholics to recognize the Pope. That's very important. That's a very big change, and it clearly is a signal for easing up, and I suspect that that's reflective of a general attitude that, and maybe the church has really the government's really discovered the church isn't any threat. Christians aren't planning to overthrow the government, or there's no reason to suppose that things aren't going to be reasonably peaceful.
Well, you've shared a lot of important points here, and we're almost out of time, but are there any parting thoughts that you'd like to share?
It's a marvelously interesting story, and at the current rate of growth, in another 15 years, there'll be more, if the current rate of growth holds, there'll be more Christians in China than in any other nation on earth.
Well, that's a great note to end on, and we've reached the end of our time, so Dr. Rodney Stark, thank you so much for joining me.
Okay, I'm glad to be with you.
This concludes our interview. More information about Purdue's Center on Religion and Chinese Society is available at purdue.edu/crcs. Visit the website to learn more about events and research on religion in China and to sign up for our free monthly e-newsletter.